I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much.
Susan Smith denied parole 30 years after killing her 2 sons. In October 1994, Susan Smith committed a barbaric act that outraged the nation. She killed her 2 young sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, by rolling them into John D. Long Lake in South Carolina. Smith initially concocted a false story about a carjacking by a black man. She convinced the public and police for 9 days, sparking a massive manhunt. But the horrifying truth was revealed. The false accusations went viral as people across the country searched for the boys, holding vigils, hanging flyers, and calling police with information. Inside Susan Smith's car, pulled from the bottom of a South Carolina lake in 1994, were the bodies of her 2 young sons, still in their car seats, along with her wedding dress and photo album. Investigators say everything that represented Smith's life was in that car, except for the husband who stood by her side on the national stage for 9 days as she lied, described a fictional carjacker, and begged for the return of her dead children, Michael, 3, and Alex, 14 months. When the car was pulled out and in the car seats were 2 beautiful little boys who had been underwater for 9 days, I saw the men and women of law enforcement just crying, said Tommy Pope, the lead prosecutor on the case, who was present when the car was pulled from John D. Long Lake. This betrayal was worse than being carjacked. And that's why this story has been around for decades. People wanted to help and were drawn to Susan. Pope told CNN. Smith's motive was reportedly an affair. The man she was seeing had refused to commit to her because he didn't want to raise the children. Under pressure to break up and start a new life, Smith chose the most brutal solution, murdering her own children. The loss of Michael and Alex and the betrayal felt so deeply by all who clung to any hope that the boys would be found. Both investigators and their families still resonate in the community. Gloria Brown Marshall, a civil rights attorney and law professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, said Smith's general description of a black man as a suspect fits with the racist stereotype of white women slandering black men as criminals that has permeated society for decades. How many black men have been detained, beaten, arrested, accused of this crime based on her word alone? Brown Marshall said. Investigators were skeptical of Smith's story from the start, and when questioned, she eventually confessed that she drove into the lake, killing her sons, at her 1995 murder trial, which was closely watched around the world. The prosecution pointed to reports that Smith was having an affair with her boss's wealthy son, who had just broken up with her because he didn't want children. Smith's attorneys argued that she was suicidal and depressed and intended to stay in the car with her children, claiming it was a murder-suicide. Pope said that argument was unfounded when law enforcement examined the car to determine whether Smith had a chance to change her mind or save her children after she drove into the lake. Investigators determined the car floated for about 6 minutes before sinking below the surface and sinking to the bottom of the lake with her 2 sons inside. This was not a tragic mistake, David Smith said at Wednesday's hearing. She intentionally wanted to end their lives. I never felt remorse from her. She never expressed that to me. At trial, prosecutors sought the death penalty. But after hearing evidence of Smith's history of sexual abuse and mental health issues, judges sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Pope, a former 16th District Attorney who worked in state law enforcement for years before becoming a prosecutor, believes Smith tried to erase any trace of her life. Smith worked at a local textile mill in the 1990s with a man who was believed to be her lover, Pope said. But when Smith received his breakup letter, she was heartbroken. He said, Susan Smith made a terrible decision that somehow, if she didn't have the kids, she was going to somehow be with this guy who was really just ignoring her. Pope said, she convinced herself, based on what he wrote, that somehow she was going to be with him. Pope said, she basically packed up her entire life and threw her in that lake. Pope said he had asked for the death penalty for Smith, but the jury decided on life in prison, believing that the harsher punishment for her would be to serve life in prison so she could reflect on her actions. But Pope said he did not believe that was true, pointing to her internal disciplinary actions during her 3 decades in prison. From her cell, Smith continued to insist she was a good mother. In a 2015 letter to the state newspaper in South Carolina, she wrote, "Something was very wrong that night. I was not myself. I am a good mother and I love my boys. There was no motive because it was not even a planned event. I was not in my right mind. I am not the monster that society thinks I am." Smith also has a poor prison record, including multiple disciplinary actions. Her first offense occurred in 1997 when she was arrested for carrying a prohibited item, a razor. Then, in 2000, Smith was transferred from the Women's Correctional Center after 2 guards pleaded guilty to having sex with her. The following year, Smith violated the rules by not standing for a count and was confined to her cell for 45 days. In 2010 and 2015, she was given disciplinary detention and lost her cafeteria privileges for using drugs, including marijuana, according to the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Most recently, she was stripped of her tablet computer privileges for violating prison rules by discussing making a documentary. At her parole hearing, Smith wept and apologized, saying she was remorseful and wanted forgiveness. However, the victim's family, especially David Smith, the father of 2 young children, has strongly opposed parole. David Smith has spoken bitterly about his life since losing his children, the dark days, the immense pain, and the immense loss. His daughter, Savannah, who was born after her 2 brothers died, says the family and the community continue to suffer because of Susan Smith's actions. Prosecutors Tommy Pope and Kevin Brackett have stressed that Smith was always self-centered. She lied for 9 days, blamed a black man, and showed no real remorse. Hayden Smith, a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of South Carolina, said Smith's chances of being paroled are slim because research shows that the main factor influencing parole decisions is the presence of a victim or the victim's family. He said her disciplinary record and media attention may also have played a role in the outcome. But the professor said the presence of her ex-husband and 14 witnesses at Susan Smith's parole hearing made her chances almost zero. Victims coming out, giving statements, that's the core part of this. The dynamic that's going on in the room, that relationship. The parole board really listens to that, said Hayden Smith, who conducts research for the State Corrections Department and interviewed Susan Smith while she was incarcerated. As of the first week of November, the Office of Victim Services had received at least 360 letters, emails, and text messages about Smith's parole hearing, all but 6 of which opposed her parole, the department said. According to the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole is granted to violent offenders in only about 8% of cases. The professor said that parole for violent offenders puts pressure on an already under-resourced system. In Susan's case, she's been incarcerated for a long time. You often have mental health issues, housing issues, victim notification, and a whole host of sanctions, said Hayden Smith, describing the post-release parole process. Ultimately, the parole board voted unanimously to deny Susan Smith parole. The decision reaffirmed that her actions in the killing of her children were unforgivable, no matter how much time has passed. David Smith said he will continue to appear at every parole hearing to ensure that justice is served for Michael and Alex. He wants people to remember the 2 innocent children who would have been in their 30s by now, if they had not been murdered by their own mother. The Susan Smith case is not only a story of crime, but also a verdict on betrayal, distorted maternal love, and the terrible consequences when people put selfishness above unconditional love for their children.